Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frankie Goes to Hollywood. I'm Mike Essel. I'm Dean of the School of Art, and I'd want to welcome you to Cooper Union and to the Cooper Together Global Block Party. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Frankie, for being here today. After Frankie's presentation, we'll take questions in the chat. A few years ago, when I first started as Dean, I learned Frankie was working at Industrial Light and Magic. For those of you who may not know, Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM as the nerds call it, was founded by George Lucas and is synonymous with the production of the Star Wars movies. I'm a Star Wars mega nerd, so my immediate question was, can I get a tour? I got to meet Frankie at ILM and he showed me around. It's an incredible place. I even got to see the Holy Grail from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like the actual Grail was just like in a case in the hallway. After the tour, we caught up and I asked him about his path from Cooper to ILM, and what he told me really stayed with me. Frankie was telling me about how he had worked to automate the process of creating dogfights in outer space, that instead of hand composing all the shots, they could use artificial intelligence to have the ships fight on their own. I asked Frankie, how does a BFA grad go to create automated systems for ILM? And Frankie said, it's just design, Mike. I knew then that I was going to invite him back to speak at Cooper Union. So Frankie Rodriguez graduated from Cooper Union in 1999 and began work as a Flash animator in New York. In 2003, he moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in film, and since then has worked on films such as Superman Returns, Night of the Museum, Star Wars Rogue One, and tonight Frankie is going to talk about recent work at Disney on Frozen 2. Please join me in welcoming Frankie Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for that introduction. It doesn't sound like it's something that I did. When you put it that way, it sounds so much more exciting than all the hours of labor. But yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I'm really proud to be a member of Cooper Union's esteemed alumni. And I want to start by showing my demo reel first. And this is the reel that I had in live action VFX that I used before I got into Disney. There's going to be a slideshow afterwards where I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour of my career. And afterwards, I'm going to show you some work that I did on Frozen and kind of break down those elements so that you can get a sense of what all that stuff culminated into. So everything that I learned and all the knowledge I gained along the way kind of came together in this last shot. So without further ado, here's going to be my demo reel. I have to share my screen, and then off we go.
All flights, man your station. Get set up. Get set up. Get
12 seconds to impact.
Get set up. Get set up for your attack run. Blasting on fools. Blasting on fools. Blasting on fools. Blasting on fools. Now sit your ass in the back.
All right, well, welcome back. Well, let me first start by saying that all the work you just saw was done with an enormous amount of collaboration. This is all such an incredibly complex process that that it requires a ton of talented individuals working together on sharing a vision. So I want to give everybody thanks that has helped in all of this work. So how did I get from Cooper Union to a career in visual effects? Well, it was the mid to late 1990s when I first attended Cooper Union. And effects in movies were just making their transition from practical effects like models and explosions to computer graphics. Jurassic Park and Toy Story had only recently come out in theaters, so there were no majors or formal degrees in visual effects at that time. To me, these movies might as well have been made in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, because all I knew back then was that Lucasfilm and Pixar were tucked somewhere in Marin County, like really far away. And it just seemed like they were in an ivory tower somewhere that was inaccessible. And it was all so mysterious. Back then, there was barely a World Wide Web and no LinkedIn, so you couldn't look up people and stalk them. I didn't intend on doing visual effects in the first place, believe it or not. So I want to get started by showing you this slide here. It's a slide about success. And it's never, ever, ever a straight line. It's more like that wiggly line that you see there on the right. I like to think of each inflection point as a moment where either luck, friendship, or just straight up dogged determination helped me get through some unexpected bend. At every turn, I was learning and I was picking up knowledge that I had no idea was going to serve me later. So CGI didn't exist when I was a kid. So it wasn't my initial calling. And as far as fine art is concerned, I wasn't really exposed to much that wasn't in popular culture. And that is not me, for those of you who are wondering. CGI, what I was really interested in, sorry about that, was the comic books and video games and all the stuff that interested kids in the 80s. As far as I can remember, I always wanted to make animated movies. I got my hands on a lot of these how-to drawing books and learned to draw by either copying or following along. I also read up a lot on animation, how these cartoons were made. It blew my mind that these drawings that I'd made could somehow move and tell a story someday. And animation incorporated motion, music, and story unlike any other medium. These books inspired me to learn more about art. I didn't want to limit myself to being an animator. I really wanted to understand what inspired those artists and get to the root. During high school and college, I focused mostly on my figure drawing skills with the goal of becoming a Disney animator. I was addicted to drawing. I also really liked graffiti, but was too square to fully commit. I had a few friends who did graffiti and went along with them on a few bombing runs, but that was it. That love of lettering led me to a calligraphy course at Cooper Union. Calligraphy was one of those classes that focused on technique, skill, craft, and it was also a great way for me to try to impress my graffiti buddies. And that actually is me there. So graphic design courses felt like a natural extension of calligraphy, and it wasn't something that I had expected to fall into at the time, but I felt like I needed to work on something that would get me a job after college. And Cooper had an esteemed faculty in that space with the likes of Paul Rand and Milton Glaser, among others. I learned to tune my presentation skills, organize concepts, and communicate ideas. It was here that I first made my leap into digital art with Photoshop, Quark, and Illustrator. I actually really learned to gain a deep understanding and appreciation of design that's going to influence me in the years to come. So one day, in the spring of '98, a classmate named Vincent Saratella found out that the engineering school was offering art students computer classes using the kind of computers that make movies. I might as well have heard that they were making Jurassic Park in that building. The school had invested in Silicon graphics machines, which priced in at about $30,000 each. This was the kind of hardware required to make movies in those days, or visual effects. As you can imagine, CGI was not very accessible. It was the late great Professor Chaikin who was the one who opened up this class to art students. He gave us time to learn a package called Houdini, and we were given this dense, obtuse manual that was written mostly for computer scientists. There was no YouTube, no Vimeo. We had to struggle mostly on our own. as exciting as it wasn't, the process was a little bit too difficult, and I lost a little bit of patience with it, to be honest. But in the end, it opened up possibilities that I hadn't expected. A few years after graduation, Vincent Saratella, or Vinny as his friends call him, left to Los Angeles to make movies, and I didn't. My senior year, renowned dancer and choreographer Bill T. Jones held the Robert Guathmy Chair at Cooper, which is a rotating professorship in art and architecture. He was collaborating with a studio called Riverbed on a motion capture project. I was invited to participate because of my interest in CGI. The scope, however, changed, and I became involved in the design of an interactive website instead. I had to learn a package called Flash and a tiny little bit of scripting to get it done. With that knowledge, my first jobs out of college were in Flash animation. I was designing online video games, banner ads, or digital shorts for movies. The most consequential of these was a Star Wars Lego stop motion project. Flash animation wasn't satisfying. I had to learn how to get back on course with what I really wanted to do. I moved to LA in 2003 with the hopes of doing storyboarding as a last-ditch effort to get me into the movies. When that failed, I was ready to head back to New York City. Vinny, however, suggested I get an internship at Side Effects, the software company that makes Houdini. He hadn't stopped doing Houdini since he first started back in those days in Chaikin's class, and had found success at Sony Pictures Imageworks. He had some connections in Side Effects in Santa Monica and made a recommendation. Side Effects should have never hired me. I hadn't gone to VFX school. I had very basic knowledge of Houdini. I had hardly any programming background, but I applied anyways. I threw everything I had at that interview: Flash animation, graphic design, calligraphy, drawing, storyboards, etc. In one of those 3 interviews, a master Houdini artist named Peter Bomar saw the Lego Star Wars animation. Peter was a Star Wars fan, and that's all it took. The reason I got hired at Side Effects, which I believe to this day, was a Lego Star Wars Flash animation short. Soon, Peter left Side Effects and me to go to Rhythm and Hue Studios while I continued to work at Side Effects. After a year and a half of learning everything I could on the job, I still didn't feel ready, but it was time to join production. Peter got me the interview at Rhythm and Hues when the time was right. I interviewed as an artist. I kept telling him that I'm an artist, but I did something wrong. Somehow I got hired in the lighting pipeline. And I don't know how I ended up there, but it seems to me that Peter thought that he needed a team that he can trust to help him with his lighting pipeline in the first movie, Superman Returns. This forced me to learn programming. It was not easy, and I don't recommend doing this, having to learn on the job. After a few effect shots and more pipeline and tool development, I needed a break from all this technical stuff, but I still wanted to be an artist. R&H was in need of texture painters and was looking to hire from within. They put out a call for interviews. I thought, why not? I can paint. So over the course of a long weekend, where I basically slept at the studio, I taught myself texture painting and was hired. There, I met a friend named Aaron Wilson. Aaron was a skilled texture painter and who showed me the ropes. But then he left. Just like Peter and just like Vinny, Aaron left. For a while then, I went back and forth between effects and texture painting for the next few shows. Because of the different roles I took on, I had a broader understanding of how all the departments functioned. After only 3.5 years, I was offered position as an effects supervisor on Night at the Museum Battle of the Smithsonian. It was an opportunity I couldn't or shouldn't pass up. Even though I felt way in over my head, I accepted. I had to use all the design and art skills I had amassed to approach this large task. With the support of an amazing team and a lot of long hours, we were able to succeed. I kind of feel I was always prepared to take on challenges that were more than I can chew. And a lot of that has to do with the resilience and resourcefulness that I was taught at Cooper. Soon after, I got a call from Aaron Wilson. He had gone to Industrial Light and Magic. If you don't know, SIGGRAPH is a conference for computer professionals. And if you do know, it's still called SIGGRAPH. I was headed to SIGGRAPH in New Orleans to present on Night at the Museum. A day or two before, Aaron Wilson called and told me they were looking for Houdini artists. Aaron, my friend from the texture painting world, got me an interview at an effects position at ILM. Luckily, I had my laptop with me. I whipped together a new demo reel in New Orleans while others were out partying. I interviewed then and there. 3 months later, I got the invitation to work at ILM in San Francisco. From there on out, it was the dream. It wasn't easy, but I got there, and I had the honor to work with many of the heroes in the world of visual effects that I had as a kid. I had the privilege of learning from all of these masters, and there were people that I had worked with that I didn't know were involved in some iconic techniques or visuals, such as the morphing technique on Willow, the Y-wing from Star Wars, and even Photoshop. Some of these people had worked on the original Star Wars trilogy, Indiana Jones, E.T., Terminator 2, and Jurassic Park. Through many years of rigorous training, I got to work on a bunch of Marvel movies, a Jurassic Park movie, and even Star Wars, not once, but twice. And now I'm at Walt Disney Animation Studios, my original destination. I was able to get into Disney with the demo reel I showed you guys earlier. I also had a long history with a lot of the artists that worked there. These friends that I made along the way were now inviting me to join them. An important thing to know is that Disney owns its own content and has full ownership of the entire process, which is really exciting. Everything to do with making an animated movie is done in that building. They write their stories, direct, produce, conceptualize, and even record the sound there. I'm surrounded by literally the best artists in the biz. The inspiration there is incredible. I get to go upstairs and peek at concept art that I could never tell you about. I get to ask artists whatever questions I want in the most casual way. I feel so lucky to be always surrounded by immense talent and to always be the dumbest guy in the room. And with that, I'd like to show you a shot that I designed from the movie Frozen 2.
In the climactic finale, the destruction of the dam unleashes an immense flood of water that makes its way through a fjord and threatens to destroy Arendelle. The section where Elsa and the Knock run down the face of the flood will require the water to take a specific shape to give our characters a clear read. For this section, we developed a more art-directed approach. Forces were sculpted in order to generate a more predictable result.
All right, so let me just start by talking about the actual shot and the sequence that I worked on. It was a series of these shots towards the end when Elsa breaks in front of the big flood and then creates this big magical dam or a barrier that we were calling it. This symbol in the middle here is called the Unity symbol, and it was a big graphic element that we somehow needed to incorporate with a larger, more organic kind of a feel. So the effects supervisor or the effects director on the show, his name is Dan Lund. He came over to me and expressed kind of the concept. And initially he thought, well, I'm thinking about some kind of an effect like a blow dryer blowing against water. But that seemed kind of a little bit too small in scale. So I started to look for reference. The first reference that I found was this helicopter rotowash. Let me see if this opens up. What I liked about this footage was the scale and how large and enormous these shapes were. And also, if you look at the white water, there's a lot of an organic feel there that radiated outwards. And I felt that if I could somehow speed this up and create a shape, that I would get something that was compelling. This here is a particle render from within Houdini. This is what it looks like for us behind the scenes. We work inside of Houdini in points, and we don't do very much surfacing until later down in the pipeline. Here, we're looking at this from a side angle and from a front angle. This was initially designed so that we could just see it from the front, and the shape came out kind of a semicircle, but we hadn't quite resolved what we would do with the side view here. How were we going to indicate that there was some sort of a magical barrier that kept the water in? As you see here, there's an invisible collision where the water is hitting, but I needed to come up with some sort of a design that I thought was a little bit more interesting. So if you look here on this slide, you can see my notes, but you can also see that the shape that I designed here was a little bit interesting. It was my daughter who was playing in the house one day, and she was wearing a tiara. And I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't that be great if we shaped the side of this like a tiara, because Elsa, after all, is royalty. And it was a way to solve that problem as well. Also, this unity symbol initially was standing straight up, and one of the decisions we made was to kind of have it lay flat on that surface. The colors here represent changing states. So it's going from liquid to ice. And those colors will end up driving the shading of those particles later on. When it came time to show the directors, this is what I showed them the very first time. And what I think is interesting about this is that I decided not to show them anything that was rendered. I decided just to show them things that were very graphic. And the reason for that is that I wanted to maintain the discussion within certain parameters. I didn't want them to start talking about the lighting. I didn't want them to start talking about the surfacing. I wanted to just focus on the timing and the height and what the components were. So this is one of those examples where I think presentation came into play and the graphic elements really came through. The directors were able to then talk about which pieces they wanted to shift in timing, or which pieces were working or which were not working. Luckily, at this point, they're pretty sold on this, and the next step was just to go forward and surface it. So in order to surface this, there are a lot of elements that are required. And one of the elements that I created was this element here, which is the frosting element that goes onto the surface. It's red here just for our visualization sakes and for us to just kind of get a sense of how fast that's going and what kind of a texture it's going to be. It's not that complex, as you could tell, but when you have tons and tons of textured layers, such as textures that control the specular highlights of a material or textures that control the bump of a material, all of those things kind of come together in the end for the final image. And I'm going to play back through it real slowly so you can see kind of what all those elements are. I had a little bit of help with these elements of water that are coming out this way. My supervisor, N. Ramos, jumped in to add some little sweeteners in there. The big water coming towards us, I did a setup from an artist named Hendrik Pons. And one of the things in terms of the surfacing that I thought would be interesting would be to have that water crash against this translucent material, so you can get a sense of the enormity of the splash. So that inspiration came from a friend of mine who was working on the Jurassic Park ride, and there was a dinosaur that was kind of swashing up against the water and splashing the water. Sloshing up against the tank, and the water would splash up against the tank, and it felt really huge. And I thought, oh, that'd be cool. It would be really cool to see that water behind that ice. And you can see there's some of the frosting. So not all of it is completely transparent. That layer I showed you earlier controls the translucency there. And all of these little tiny shapes are little diamonds, little crystal diamonds that are copied onto all of those points to give it that shape. So that pretty much concludes the presentation. I hope you enjoyed that.
I did. Thank you. Wow. So I have a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from the chat, I think. But thank you for sharing. Um, so just the shot from Frozen, like let's say from the day you get the assignment until you actually see it fully rendered, about to go out the door.
Yeah.
What's the time frame?
Well, the interesting thing is it depends. It depends on how far along the concept has been bought off on. There are some times where you get a shot where you get concept art and it's very clear and you know exactly what you need to go for. And there's sometimes where the concept art is not fully realized. And I kind of like it when it's not 1,000% realized,
Mhm.
because then you can kind of inject your own ideas. But between the time that you get it to the time that it delivers, it could be months. I think this one took like 3 months, 3 or 4 months. And the reason for that is that it's not just one shot. There's like a side shot. There's another shot where it dissolves and kind of falls back into the
Right.
water. But once you get the setup bought off on, that initial part can then be repeated into the other shots. But you never know. Sometimes the shot will work. Like in this situation, the shot worked from like right in front of you. But when you turn it to the side, we didn't know what it was going to look like. And that's when that tiara idea came in. So there's a lot of unknowns.
And that's just so everybody understands. That's one of, say, how many shots in the film?
Oh, in the film?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have that number, but hundreds.
But it's a lot, right? It's
100%.
like an unbelievable amount of shots. So the team must be incredibly large to make movies like
The
this.
effects department itself is somewhere in the 30s. So there's 30 something artists in the effects department, give or take, depending on how many they hired on at the time. And there's some people who are permanent artists.
Wow. Okay. I have more questions, but I'll save them for after we do some from the chat. So the first question I have is, what's your favorite project? Can you say?
Yeah, I could say my favorite project. Well, to be honest, there's a few favorite projects. There's the ones that I love just because Star Wars was. I didn't even when I got into the business, Star Wars the prequels had already passed me by, and while I was at Lucasfilm in 2012, Disney bought us, and Lucas himself and Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger flew into a hangar in San Francisco. They bust us all out there, and we were like, what the hell is going on? Why are we all being bussed out here? And they're like, oh, we got a big announcement to make. Well, what's that? What's going on? And then George Lucas comes on. He's like, oh, I'm about to sell. And we were like, holy cow. And obviously we couldn't tell anybody. But then he said, and I've written 3 treatments. And we all knew what that meant. But at the time, it wasn't quite clear whether he was, it was going to be his story or it was going to be Disney's story. But we knew new Star Wars movies are coming along. So I was like, I couldn't believe that I was going to get a chance to work on Star Wars at that point, because after the prequels, nobody knew anything else was going to be made. So I would say Star Wars.
Yeah.
And then
That was your life. That was your dream, right? Oh, I don't mean to talk over you. Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really exciting for me was the Soarin' ride. The Soarin' ride at Disneyland. If anybody's ever been on that, at the end of this ride, it's huge. It's like these 6 screens, each of them rendered at 4K, and you ride through all these different places in the world. And towards the end, you ride through a fireworks display. And it was inspired by this drone that somebody had sent up into these fireworks in the sky, and we used that as a reference. So every screen was 4K resolution. It was super high fidelity. But what I like about that is that every 20 minutes or so, when we're not in COVID, somebody's on that ride. And when I've been on that ride, there's always like a really happy applause at the end. It's just such a great feeling to know that people really like viscerally enjoyed that ride. And then Patty Jenkins, who's on here on the other day, they did almost exactly the same kind of sequence in Wonder Woman, where they're flying through the ship. They're flying on the ship through the fireworks. It's all going on around them.
Oh,
It's
wow.
it's inspired basically on that. I'm positive it's based on that same footage that was out on YouTube. Not on my stuff, but on the stuff that somebody else shot.
All right. Here's another question is, what are some of your goals what do you want to accomplish in the future?
Oh, that's interesting.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's really weird because you get to this point where you're like, holy cow, Star Wars is behind me. For your entire life, it's like this unattainable goal that's in front of you. And you have all these things, and all of a sudden, like some of these things are behind you. Disney movies are behind me, and not only a Disney movie, like, a really big Disney movie. And you start to think to yourself, well, what's next? You can always move up in positions there, and Disney's really great at allowing people to move into leadership roles. So I thought that I can continue on that route, but to kind of accelerate that, and also to allow more doors to open, because things just keep changing in technology so much. I've actually started. I went back to school to work on a degree in physics, and I thought to myself, well, math and physics are only going to help me be a better effects artist, but can also open up doors for things that I don't even know are possible yet. I mean, there's AI, artificial intelligence is happening. There's neural networks happening. There's all sorts of things happening with imaging techniques that are kind of dangerous, like all that deep fake technology and stuff like that. So I don't know exactly what that's going to lead to. I just know this, at the very least, it's going to make this job, make me a better artist at what I do now, and in the future open up some sort of unknown possibility.
I don't know anything about physics, but that's okay because I'm a dean now. Is there a particular crit from Cooper that you remember or come back to?
A particular crit? Oh, yes. Yes, I do. So I was in a sculpture class, and they gave us this piece of wood, like literally a log, like a 2-foot log.
Mhm.
And I don't remember the teacher's name. I wish I remembered his name. He was a sculpture professor. And he said, just go and make a sculpture out of this and put it somewhere that's site specific in the building. And I remember going in, and I was like, I was going to do something kind of cubist, like a guitar, some kind of a form that had these curves, and just kind of designed it all nice and polished and put it in this location in Cooper that had like a shelf and like a divider, and it was going to just fit right into that divider. And as I was trying to carve these shapes out of the log, I started cutting these like horizontal slats up and down this curve so that I can chip at the wood and get that form, and then eventually, sand it down. But one of the guys in the sculpture department had a look at that, and he's like, oh my God, that's so beautiful, right at that midway point. And I didn't understand like what he meant. I was like, it's not polished. I haven't finished it yet. And he's like, no, like you got to really think about the nature of the medium and the nature of the material. Like what that material is saying to you at this point. It's telling you to stop. You don't need to go any further than that. And I always held that because, a lot of times, even when I'm building these things, you can go throw all sorts of little tchotchkes and little things that distract and make it overly complicated, and you lose and muddy up the effect. But with that lesson in mind, I really always keep that. It's like, okay, what that element that I showed with the unity symbol and the splash behind it, that was where that all came through. I was like, I'm not going to show anything that's irrelevant. I'm only going to show the things that are relevant. And then you start to add little sweeteners as it calls you out. You got to let the work talk to you.
I had a similar experience in Crit, by the way, about materials. It seems like a thread through a lot of Cooper Union critiques. So there's a question's a little technical, so I don't want to overwhelm you with it. But so you started in Flash. You now, I think, primarily work in Houdini, like you said. Mm-hmm. What was it like learning in that? Like what was that process like, moving your brain from one scripting language to another, kind of, and. Yeah. Like somebody's interested in that because they see it as like an intersection of art and science.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, now one of the things that I was able to help influence when I was at Side Effects was these example files and this documentation that went into the software. And the reason that I got so impassioned by that, and Peter was the one who started this, and I fell right in with his vision, was that I wish I had that kind of material when I was learning. That it was this dense, thick book that no matter how you tried to read it, if you had no computer science background, all you were doing was pushing buttons and you didn't know what you were following along. So it was really tough to learn that way. So I got frustrated initially when I was at the engineering school, which is kind of why I was like, oh man, there's a lot of work for some very little response. As a painter, as somebody who draws, you're getting immediate feedback. But with computers, you got to, especially simulations, you can run those things 24 hours. and you don't know what, you go home at night and you say a Hail Mary, and then you come back the next day and you're like, oh my God, that just didn't work. And you know, you're coming up against deadlines. So that kind of a process from switching my brain from an artist to having to knowing that I had to wait and losing that immediacy as an artist was hard. It was really, really hard for me. And I still wrestle with that to this day. And part of what drives me in all the jobs that I've held is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. I'm driven by how fast can I get to the image. I don't have a lot of patience for rendering and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, I want to see an image as fast as I can. And so it's a lot of real-time technology that's out there that's starting to become very interesting. And so I'm looking into that a little bit as well. And yeah, that's kind of the struggle of going from one brain to the other. But you have Vimeo now, and you have YouTube now.
It is easier now. Yeah,
it's way
for
easier.
sure.
I'm gonna have a drink if you don't mind.
No, go for it. This next question I don't quite get, so I'm going to skip to an easier one while I figure it out. Well, I have a question that you could maybe turn into this question. So you mentioned how you come back to your Cooper education, right? That you return to it as, I don't know, lessons learned, inspiration, all those things. You know, you went on to do something very specific with a generalist degree, right? Do you ever think back, I wish I majored in in effects production? Do I wish I concentrated?
That's a really good question. There were years where, yeah, I thought to myself, man, maybe I should have just gone to Cal Arts and I could have become an animator. But one of those things, somebody told me a story that if you ever think back on your past and you ever try to trade your experience for another experience, you're just trading one set of problems for another. And the other set of problems, had I gone to some school like Cal Arts, just that was limited to animation, what happened realistically was that 2D animation, what I wanted to do as an industry, pretty much floundered in the States. The work went overseas, and it was starting to look, unfortunately, it's not, but was starting to look like a dead medium at that time, and computer graphics were becoming more exciting. So I think it was one of those things where I was glad that I got that education at Cooper, because I had to, it wasn't like these things were immediately advertised. You had to go look for them. The teachers were there, the faculties were there, the students were there, the support was there. You just had to go out there and look for them and find them. And then you'd have to learn. But because you could take like paper making, print making, this and that, and all these other weird things, which I took, you know, I took some printmaking courses and et cetera, et cetera. You start to try to see like a through line behind all of this as you mature. It doesn't happen right when you're at Cooper's. As you get older, you start to say to yourself, oh, well, this is the common thread. This is the core of what it is to be an artist. And then the medium is a layer on top of that. But beneath all of that, there's a core. And I think that's kind of what Cooper was able to teach us.
Thank you for that.
You get at that just like the base concept.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. I mean, I went into something very specific, but I felt very prepared. So I understand what you mean. So I have a question of, you know, like what kind of art class should an engineer take? And then I have a question that's also just sort of, do you have advice for students now?
What kind of art class would an engineer take to do like visual effects, or just to?
Yeah, like if you would recommend, I think what they're wondering is like, what's the entry level? Like, where should I go if I'm interested?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think anything that requires observation, strict observation to begin with, because you can get in and start talking about this theory, but if you don't understand, I mean, in the end, we're making visual arts, so you're making something you see. So if you can understand how those pure concepts work, which requires a lot of deep study, like painting and drawing, I think you absolutely have to understand that. And then as you expand, you start thinking about composition and color. There's a really good book by Bruce Block, and it's about, I forget what it's called, but it's about how you frame and compose art, and it's of film. And it's a really, really interesting book because it starts talking about like how Alfred Hitchcock and all these other directors would do all sorts of weird and interesting things that you would never understand on set, that all incorporated all these kind of design elements. Like they would lower ceilings in shots to make the shot feel more intense, things like
Right,
that,
right.
right? And
Or
that,
like dig a hole and put the camera in the ground, things
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah, right.
And you as a viewer don't understand that they did that. But but if you don't understand how to compose a frame, how to compose a scene, then everything else falls apart. And I think it's the same thing with design, right? Design, you're definitely composing what's on that page, and in painting, you're composing what you see there. So I think you need to get to that kind of an understanding. The technical stuff, like I said, is getting easier and easier and easier. It's not that easy, but you can definitely learn that on your own.
All right. I think I get this question now, the one I skipped. So I'm just going to read it. It's interesting how VFX meshes with both art appeal and physical practicality on a computerized landscape. Have you noticed kooky things when editing that builds on a nuance in reality? For instance, the patterns or placement of splatters, the unique patterns of rocks and mountains, how light, like, I guess the question is like, does reality feel weirder to you now that you have to render it?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I mean, I can go off and off on this. All right, I'm taking let me start with this, right? I'm taking a math course right now, and this is going to get a little too philosophical, but all right. So there's the world of form and the world of ideas, right? And materialism is the thing that you can touch and feel, and there's ideas, right? For years, mathematicians are trying to figure out, and most mathematicians were religious, and so Descartes, who built the Cartesian grid, who was one of those guys. Everything that we do in CG is based on the Cartesian grid, right? And he wanted to prove the existence of God, literally prove the existence of God. And in order to take God, this concept that you can't see, and turn it into form, if God is made by these abstract principles like numbers, how do we convert that into geometry? And so he created the graph. So you have points, and then you have a line, and you do that with numbers. He unified algebra with geometry in hopes of proving the existence of God, right? So as you're doing these simulations, the reason I say this is because like you're watching paint dry sometimes. You're like, sit there and run a sim, and you're like, oh my God. And then it starts to do things and starts to present behaviors. And when you're working late at night, you start to believe that they have its own thinking, that it's doing its own thing, that it's telling you something, and you're like, oh no, God, I got to switch this. And then even in more complicated things, if you look at movies like Doctor Strange, right? They have this sequence where it just gets all kaleidoscopic and these Mandelbrot systems, right? My friends at ILM created these systems where like you can continuously dive into these Mandelbrot system. And it was an Ant-Man too. And the system just kept regenerating patterns. And when you watch that, you think to yourself, because you're like, this is math. And this is like, and images that nobody could predict start showing in those images. It's really, really kind of profound. So yeah, that's why I'm going back to math school.
Couple more questions. So if a student at Cooper right now is very passionate about narrative animation, right? What would be the next step for them? Like, is it an internship? Is it what would you recommend?
So there's two parts to that. There's the career driven part, and then there's the actual learning for learning's sake part. We're lucky at Disney that all the animation festivals, and we get presentations and talks and things like that. They come and they give us all these sorts of presentations from animations that are shown, the animation show of shows, and et cetera, the things that show at the Academy. Like, watch these like experimental films, because the more of that kind of esoteric artwork that you can see, the more exciting your art is going to be. Don't just become like cookie cutter and try to redraw Elsa or redraw so and so, or try to make one of these movies. Like, try to make something weird during those times, because like when you try to make something weird, you're going to come up with like all these unknown things that you're going to pick up along the way. And I have to say, I'm going to do the Hollywood name drop thing. I worked with Dennis Murin at ILM, and for those of you who don't know who he is, He's the guy who did the VFX on ET and Star Wars. He did the AT-ATs and all this stuff. And when we were at ILM, he gave us a presentation and he showed us his work from the 1950s when he was a kid, like an 8-year-old kid. And he was trying to do avalanches like in a dirt mound. He had like his little action figures there and he was pulling a trapdoor and letting the avalanche fall. And he was like, I don't understand why that didn't look real. But then a year later, I tried slowing or speeding the film up to try to get it to look a little bit bigger. And he was like, he kept talking through that, right? And you're like, wow. And then he goes, and then when I got to Empire Strikes Back, and you're like, oh my God, it's just all that work just kind of came together. So you start to work on something weird, you learn the lesson from that little thing, and you don't worry about failing. You take what you learn, you move to the next one, and you move to the next one, or else you just spin your wheels and sit in one area and never grow. So career-wise, I would say in terms of, well, that's the narrative part as well, because if you're watching other people tell stories in odd and weird ways, then you can get into that. But also the technologically speaking, I would say, again, you're very lucky. You can just learn a lot of this stuff online. The software, there's always like free student versions available, et cetera. And then just reach out to people on LinkedIn. You know, there's a lot of people that'll help. I know that Disney has an internship as well that they open up, and everybody there is so kind. Like people are giving their own time to students to teach them. So there's a lot out there.
All right. I think we have time for a couple more. This was an interesting question to me. So at the level of production you're working on, like the ILMs of the world, the Disneys of the world, are there artists on staff who work only in 2D? What do they do? Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, what's really cool, there's photographers. There's photographers, designers, there's all sorts of engineers. In the early days at ILM, like they didn't know who they would hire. They just hired some guy who knew a little bit of cameras, some guy who knew how to paint a certain way, some guy who did models. There was it's just whoever showed a lot of interest in something. And so every once in a while at ILM and at Disney, you have art shows, like gallery openings. Like people just show their personal work, and they will open up an entire hallway and they will cater it with wine and all that stuff. And people bring their work and they show all of their stuff. And then a lot of the concept artists that we look at who do beautiful, beautiful artwork, and they make digital paintings, totally work in 2D. And even at ILM, like a lot of the boards that I got for something like Avengers, the big Wakanda shield, the Russell, I apologize for not remembering his last name, but I'll just say Russell, thank you. He did these stills that were variations of what we wanted things to look like, but you know, it's all in 2D. It's not in 3D. So I definitely do it.
Just to come back, since we're on this track, there's another sort of more direct question is, what would you recommend a student get into now in terms of 3D animation, like the software package? Like I don't know, like where should they start?
I would say, well, it depends. It depends on like what it is you want to do, right? A lot of people think that working in CG means that you're going to be animating characters. That's a whole role. You can do modeling, which is just literally, it's like you have an architect's mind and you build all of the backgrounds and the scenery and all that stuff. But look for software that you can kind of grasp right off the bat. Something like Blender is pretty good way of kind of breaking in. And then once you get an understanding of that and how that works, then get a little bit more into procedural work. I mean, I'm partial to Houdini, but I also think that really is a way of you become a programmer because it's visual programming blocks. You tend to learn that anyways. So I'd say start slow and then jump into Houdini as soon as you can.
Wow.
Plug for side effects.
So one of your classmates is in the chat, though I didn't get their name. So they remember taking Chaikin's class with you, and the waiting many hours to see her render caused them to go on a different career path, they say.
Yeah.
How long, they're curious, how long do you need to wait these days to see your work animate or function in order to make adjustments? Like, is it more real time now?
There's a lot of real-time stuff happening, which is super, super exciting. I remember first getting into fluid simulations and fluid simulations that it involves fluid mechanics. And I was always looking around like, how the hell do these other artists know what all this is all about? You know, they all had some sort of understanding of like, this is the pressure solve, this is the projection step. And they were using all these terms like, how do these people know this? And the reason they had to understand it was because every one of those steps was a very discrete, slow step, you know? And I was like, oh, when I got to, and I honestly was like, I don't know if this is for me deep into my career. When I got to ILM, they had created a piece of software proprietary called Plume, which was running on the GPU. And this is in 2008 on The Last Airbender. And for the first time, I was able to set up a smoke or a fire simulation, and I would be able to see the renders at this pace, frame after frame. And remember, you get 24 frames per second, right? And if like a frame takes, you know, sometimes 8 hours or 24 hours, you're waiting days before you can see it. And even if you have a render farm, it still takes long. But this is on the GPU, and all of a sudden I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm staying in effects. Like that was really when I decided I'm staying in effects. It was on The Last Airbender. This is in 2008. It took me about 5 years to really, because I was like, oh my God, water takes so long, or all these things. It's just, because I didn't have the patience for it. But when I started seeing that happening at that rate, and now years into it, I can compare what I've done with what was then. It's definitely getting much more accessible and much more fun.
This sort of piggybacks on the last question. So what was the hardest project you've ever worked on, and how did you find inspiration and grit to complete it?
My hardest project, okay, so again, I'm gonna do the Hollywood name drop thing just because
Do it.
I love these guys. John Knoll, who I've had the honor of working with
Wow.
closely, like, you know, those behind the scenes DVDs where there's people like that pointing at the screen. You know, I was in that room with him with like 2 other people, like trying to solve these problems. And one of them, he wrote Rogue One. He was also the one of the guys who did the that water tendril on The Abyss.
Okay.
And he was also the VFX supervisor on the prequels, et cetera, et cetera. And he and his brother invented Photoshop.
Yep.
Which is pretty damn big. And so I got to work with him. But I remember I was on after Battleship that he had this big presentation. He said, we're going to change our entire pipeline. And the effects department was transitioning from their proprietary software to off-the-shelf software, which was Houdini. One of the reasons I got hired there that I learned later was to help start the Houdini pipeline. And he stood up in front of everybody. He says, we're going to need people who have a positive attitude, no naysayers. If you are a naysayer, we don't want you on this show. And the entire pipeline changed. Every single aspect of it changed. And I was put in there as a lead. And it was a hard show for me to lead on because we were given a lot of restrictions in terms of how much engineering support we were going to get. So I did my best trying to install a runway. Future was my thinking. I was like, we can't build all of these tools for this show, but if I can build a runway and make it really organized and very slick so that other artists can come and build on top of that road, then we're going to get a pipeline that works. But it was a very, very, very tough show to deliver and to build a pipeline at the same time. It was extremely, extremely, extremely difficult. And that one, you know, we lost a lot of men.
There's a couple questions that I'm going to try to merge, so my apologies to the people who asked them. But so there's a question of like, how do you balance your analog and digital design time, right? And there's also a question of like, what's the review process like? Like, how often are you showing? How often is work in discussion? And I imagine those two go together, because I guess you probably are sketching at some point before you go on computer.
Yes. Yes, and I'll tell you why the analog is super, super important. I did not have all of this engineering background, mathematical and whatnot. So I had to express my ideas through drawing. That was the only way that I can come to an engineer and say, this is what I'm trying to do. I don't know what this little thing means, but that's what I'm trying to get. And I would draw it, and not just draw it and show them a finished drawing. I'd sit there and sketch it in front of them. So they get the idea of the motion that I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to accomplish. Little arrows and all sorts of other things. I've even thought of taking like those sketchbooks and making them into like a work of art and calling it like Pacific Rim, you know, and it's just a bunch of scribble scrabble and stuff like that. But they all that have some sort of a meaning. So the way I convey my ideas is through sketching. And at Disney, they had an exercise where we took uh, a real like a fire effect, like a little salamander was shooting fire, and Olaf is doing this to him, and he's like on fire. And they were like, "Hey, we want you guys to practice 2D hand-drawn animation." So I spent some time doing some 2D hand-drawn animation, and we got critiqued on that and all that stuff. And you can tell the difference of what an effects that tells a good story is versus an effects that doesn't really sell when it's plotted out that way. And that's the magic that they have at Disney, is like these guys come from a 2D animation background, and so they can understand what a shape means and versus like what a simulation means. And so that takes a lot of 2D practice.
Well, that's a very good answer. So people who say are very invested in 2D storytelling, there is work out there and a place for them in these kind of productions.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like it was before where you had
Sure.
factories of workers, but a lot of the concept artists that are there, which I mentioned, I mean, I get to go to the top floor where it's not accessible to most people. And if you ever come, I'll be glad to show you around.
Nice.
You can't go to the top floor. The top floor is secret. And you get to go up there and then just walk around and literally just, you know, if you want to, you meet somebody at the caffeine patch, which is like where they have coffee. And if you meet them, you say, "Hey, I really like your work." They're like, "Yeah, sure, come by. I'll show you some stuff." And you're like, "Oh my God." You get to see all the movies
Oh,
in
wow.
production ahead of time, and all ideas that will never make it, you know, all and hand drawn, you know, hand drawn. It's fabulous. It's amazing to see.
All right, last question, and I don't even know if you can answer this, but maybe you could lie to us if you can't. What are you working on now?
Oh, I can say.
Okay.
I just finished Raya and the Last Dragon,
Oh, wow. Okay.
and that's going to be simultaneously released in theaters and on Disney Plus. And then the next movie I'm working on, I can't say exactly what it's about, but it's called Encanto, and it's a story that takes place in Colombia.
Excellent. How many projects do you work on at a time, or shows as you call them?
Now at Disney, it's one show per year mostly, and then sometimes you work on little shorts and things for Disney Plus in between. At ILM, it was like sometimes 2 shows at a time, and in a year you might be working on 3 shows. You go from one to another, and sometimes from a 911 to a 911 to a 911.
Right.
So you'd be months on end, really like working really hard. But they'd make it great. I mean, they'd have massages for us on Saturday mornings. No, I'm not kidding. You go there and they'd have a breakfast buffet. You know, I kind of like going in on Saturdays because you wouldn't have meetings. Buffet, do a little bit of work, sign up for your massage, get a massage, go down, and everybody's moving.
You're killing me. I got no massages. Nothing. I got nothing like that.
Hey, good at work, you know.
So, Frankie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off?
I want to thank everybody that I mentioned in this, and I might forget people's names just because I really want to thank Professor Chaikin. He's passed, but I want to thank his family because he was a great man. I definitely want to thank Vincent Saratella because he was the one who kind of always was the motivator behind us. He's always kind of egging us to do a little bit more. Aaron Wilson, who was the guy in texture painting, who took me under his wing and then thought of me when he went to ILM. Well, I think James Hutchinson, he was the one who led the Lego stop motion project. I also want to thank Cooper Union, of course. I want to thank New World School of the Arts, which is a school in Miami, which I went to for high school, which is, I owe them a lot. I also want to thank all the studios I worked for, because, I mean, what's amazing is once you're in, they really want you to learn. So they all teach you. So Rhythm Hues, which is no longer at the same capacity that it was, allowed me to jump from department to department, which wasn't common. So I want to thank them for that. Industrial Light and Magic, it's always going to be like my home. And then Disney, of course, another home. So
thank you. It was great, Frankie. Thank you so much. All right, so I just want to thank all of you for joining us for Cooper Together. This year marks Peter Cooper's 230th birthday, and we are raising $230,000 in support of his vision. If you enjoyed tonight and you can give, please consider supporting Cooper Union. Thanks again, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.